Probably one of my favorite sections in the scriptures. I don't know if you're technically allowed to have a favorite section, but I do. And it's really hard because I love Abraham. You know, if you listen to me preach, if you've listened to me teach at all, you know that I'm pretty hard on Abraham. I'm pretty hard on the patriarchs. And it's not because I don't love them. I'm hard on them because we need to be a people who are willing to say, that's not right. That's not okay. And when Abraham mistreats his wife, we need to be willing to say, hey, that's not all right. That's not okay. When Lot mistreats his daughters in Sodom, we need to be a people who are willing to say, that's inconsistent with the way God expects us to live. That's inconsistent with who God calls us to be. Right? But the reason I love Abraham, the reason I love the patriarchs, the reason I love people like Lot, the reason I love them is because in them I see myself. I see that tension. I see that difficulty in trying to come out of corrupt, evil, wicked cultures and to follow the path that God has laid out before us. That's why I love Matthew chapter 26 in the Garden of Gethsemane. Because Christ is our Lord, He's our King, He's the Messiah, He was the anointed one, He's the one, He's the man. And if you've ever tried to be the man, you know the man can't be weak. Right? If you're going to be the man, you've got to be tough and strong all the time. But Jesus was the ultimate man. And in Him, specifically in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see His humanity. We see weakness. But we see that weakness overcome. What I'm talking about is this. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 38, and He said to them, and if you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, they were going to the Garden of Gethsemane right after the upper room. And this is the eve of the Passover, and Jesus Himself is about to be executed. Right? And He knows this is coming. He is God. He is the Son of God. He fully knows. He's been telling them for years that He's going to die. And He knows it's coming, and so He goes to Gethsemane, and this whole week he hasn't been sleeping, He's been going to Gethsemane, He's preparing Himself for the cross, and He tells them, and He said to them, when they get to the garden, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. And if you know the story, you know they were not able to, that they constantly fell asleep on Him, that they could not stay awake and pray with Him. And honestly, you need to understand that this is a marathon. It's not like this is the first night they're being asked to stay awake. He's been coming to the garden every evening. He's been teaching all day in the temple. He goes to the garden. His disciples are with him. It's exhausting. And they can't keep up. But going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and he prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. I see that in me. I see that in me. I don't want to do the things that God has called me to do. They're hard. They're difficult. Paul calls our this walk we have with Christ, he calls it a race, and it is a race. And we are called to run it. Have you ever watched anybody run a marathon before? Have you ever seen someone who runs 5 miles, 6 miles, 10 miles, 26 miles, 32 miles, 140 miles? Have you ever seen anybody run a distance like that? When I was in the Army, I went to airborne school, and in airborne school, you've got to run 4 miles, and you've got to do it in 36 minutes to qualify. It sounds like a lot, but you know how we did it? We ran in a formation, and we sang cadences while we did it. So it's easy to look at something like that and go, oh my gosh, it's difficult. But if it's something you practice, if it's something you train, if it's something you work towards, it becomes easier and easier. By this point, Christ has had great practice at trusting in His Father. Right? At His baptism, what did God say? This is my Son with whom I am well pleased. And then He immediately went into the wilderness and was tempted by the enemy about what? If you are the Son of God. If you are the Son of God. If you are the Son of God. Oh yeah, that's what God says, but is it true? It takes great faith. It takes great practice in faith to run this race, church. And I have no doubt that's why Christ here at the end He prays, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. If it's possible, spare me the agony of the cross. If it's possible, spare me the shame and the agony and the horror of what is about to happen." And if he had stopped right there, he would not have been perfect. But instead, he continues, "Yet, not as I will, but as you will." In this moment of tension, the mission that God had been working towards for thousands and thousands of years, the redemption of mankind, the inception of the kingdom, bringing into existence the church, all of it hinged on this one moment. And in this moment, we have the greatest example of what it means to be a disciple of Christ that we could ever ask for. It's with this in mind, I'd like you to turn to Colossians chapter 3. Now, we've been moving through Colossians chapter 3, and as I've said before, Colossians, the church that meets in Colossae is very similar to us, and they're very similar to us because they did not learn of the gospel directly from an apostle, but rather they learned of the gospel, they learned of the reign of Christ, they learned of all of this from Epaphras, who went to them and proclaimed the good news. And what did he proclaim? He proclaimed to them the message that the apostles were preaching during that time. So we, church, are very similar to that church in Colossae. We're incredibly similar because we too have believed based on the testimony of the apostles, based on their teachings. And so now Paul is writing this letter to them. And he's told them here in chapter 3, in verse 15, go ahead and advance it. I don't have the slides, so go ahead and advance that for me. He said in verse 15, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts." And he has told them, "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly." And so he's explaining to them, this is how you're going to do this. This is how we do this, okay? And he looks at wives, and he says in verse 18, if you're going to let the peace of Christ rule in your heart, if you're going to let the message of Christ dwell among you, if you're going to do these things, then wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And our entire culture in the 21st century gasped in horror. Wives, submit? Oh, no. We're not doing that. I don't think so. Women need men like a fish needs a bicycle. Don't you know? Don't you know? Church, we just sang a song. We're going to talk about what submission means. We're going to talk about all that. Before we do, what does it mean to have a king? What does that mean? We have no idea as 21st century Americans what it means to have a king. And the reason we have no idea is because we got rid of our king. We had a king, his name was King George, and he lived in England, and he tried telling us what to do, and we got sick of it. So we got rid of him. We got rid of his followers, we got rid of the monarchy, we got rid of it. And then we wrote a document, first in the world, nothing like it, even to this day, and we can talk about why that's the case, why that's true. People try to say, oh no, everybody, the Western democracies aren't unique. No, ours is unique because we don't like people telling us what to do so much. We formed an entire government based on the idea that it's almost impossible for our government to tell us what to do. If you didn't know that, that's the entire point of the Constitution. The Constitution is literally designed in such a way to make the exercise of power by government almost impossible. This is the whole point. It's the whole reason. It's the whole reason it exists. So how much do we as Americans, especially here in the 21st century, not like being told what to do? Well, we've had 200 years to get really good at it. And even those countries with monarchies today really don't understand what it means to have a king. You know how I know this? Because Prince Harry from England is writing a tell-all book about the royal house, about the monarchy in England. And if people lived under a real monarchy with real authority and real power, Harry would not dare speak. Because the thrones and kings have a tendency to cut off people's heads. If you want to know what a monarchy is actually like, look at the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. And we all gasp again. Oh, that's horrible. They're a horrible government. Yeah, but that's a real monarchy. If you speak out against the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, they're going to kill you. Right? Because what does it mean to have a king? It means you do what the king says. The king says jump, you say how high. That's what it means to have a king. And church, when we went to Christ, when we bowed before him, when we went to him in the waters of baptism and said, we are yours, we were pledging to him. We were bowing our knee and taking an oath of fealty. He became our king. And so our king looks at us and he says, this is how you ought to arrange yourself. To obtain the peace that I've bought with my blood. To live out the message that I preached. That we are all now one in God. This is how you ought to be. And he looks at wives and he says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. So instead of gasping in horror at this command, we ought to say, well, wait a minute. What does that mean? What does it mean to submit? What is the expectation here? And for many years, church, there was a long time where this was something that men tried to force on women. They tried to force this on their wives. So the Bible says you ought to submit to me, so submit or I'm going to hurt you. That's not what this word means. You see, in the 21st century, submission can be forced. And you know that because in MMA, it's called a submission, right? If you're putting somebody in a submission, you're putting someone in a lock, you're forcing them to what? Submit, tap out. But in the Greek, that's not what this word means. What this word means is that you are willingly placing yourself under someone else. That's really what it means. That you are willingly choosing to be under someone else. In fact, this word stops being this word if it is forced. So what this text is not saying, husbands, is that it's up to you to force your wife to submit to you. It's not what this text is saying. What this text is saying is, wives, just as Christ surrendered himself to the church, just as Christ went to that cruel cross, just as he willingly chose to go there. In the Gospel of John, I can't recall if it's chapter 8 or chapter 10, but Jesus says, my Father loves me because I lay down my life on my own authority. And I have authority from him to pick it back up. Nobody can take my life from me. I have to give it up. And church, that's, if you're a wife, what you're called to do for your husband. But only you can choose to do it. And our wives say, and our young ladies say, well, those men aren't worthy of our respect. Those men, those husbands of ours aren't worthy. They haven't earned my submission. Thank God Christ doesn't feel the same way about you. Thank God Christ doesn't look at us, his church, and say, they have to earn my sacrifice. They have to earn me giving myself up for them. Thank God the mercy and the grace of Christ does not depend on an attitude such as that. Rather, Christ looked at us in our broken condition. He looked at us in our slavery to death and sin. He looked at us. Understand what it's like looking. I mean, if you could picture the worst junkie in the deepest throes of his addiction. And I'm using this terminology not as a pejorative against them, but to get you to understand the picture. The person who is literally looking to go from fix to fix. That's what Christ saw when he said, I'm going to die for them. I'm going to give up my life for them. I'm going to come down from heaven, take on human form, and bleed for him. Women, you are called to walk a path. Wives, you are called to walk a path that Christ has already walked before you. To surrender yourself to someone else. To give yourself up willingly for someone else. You want to know the reality, though? If you want your husband to be worthy of what the gift that you give him, if you want him to live up to that standard, it has to start with you giving yourself up. It'll never happen. Wives, listen to me. I'm telling you right now, your husband will never be the man you want him to be. He will never be the man that God calls him to be if you don't first give yourself up. No amount of digging in your heels, no amount of name-calling, no amount of antagonism, no amount of strife and grief, no amount of you telling him what he ought to do is going to have the same effect as you willingly giving yourself up to him. You willingly yielding yourself to him. So wives, if you want to have the man, if you want to have that guy who's a 9 in responsibility and spiritual leadership and all of those things, if you want that man, you've got to help him. Because if you dig in your feet and you fight and you make it a battle, he will never be the man that God calls him to be. So wives, in verse 18, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, Mason Spade got up here and read Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. And Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's what that passage says. And so, men, if you think that, she has to submit to me and I don't have to do anything, buckle up, buttercup. It's about to get real tough. Husbands, love your wives. Love your wives and do not be harsh with them. See, wives are called to give in to their husbands because that's quite frankly what the man needs. The man needs to know he has his wife's respect. He craves it. He desires it. And women, he will never ask you for it. If you don't willingly give it to him, he will be an empty vessel and a shadow. But in the very same vein, husbands, your wives desperately crave your love. And love is not a feeling. Understand, husbands, love is not the affection you feel for your wife. That's not what we're talking about here. That's very good. You should feel affection for your wife. I encourage you to feel affection for your wife. I encourage you to have deep, passionate feelings for your wife. Those are all very good things. But that's not what this text is talking about. And we can ask any of our young children to get up here and they could recite to you 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. And what love is. It's patient and it's kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes, and it always perseveres. Love never fails. You know how I know our world has no idea what love is? Because people say things like, I've fallen out of love. You can't fall out of love, church. You can choose to walk away from it. You can choose to forget it. You can choose not to do it, but you can't fall out of it. Christ looks at husbands and he says, you must love your wives. In Ephesians chapter 5, he goes over what that looks like. And that's being sacrificial, giving yourself up for her. What does that mean? Men, husbands, that means when your wife walks in and starts talking to you, don't let it be talking at you. Here's the thing. Look, guys, we are very good. We are very good at doing one thing, right? We're good at that one thing. We're not good at multitasking. You know how I know this? How many men in here, when you get lost driving, you turn down the radio? I do it all the time. My wife makes fun of me. We're sitting there listening to something on the radio, and then all of a sudden I'm trying to figure out, am I turn in there, and turn down the radio? Why? Because we can't multitask. Women can multitask. They're very good at it. But men, for the most part, we can't. And so when your wife walks in the room and she starts talking to you, put whatever is in your hands down and give her the attention. Preacher, but you don't understand. I was in the middle of an article. I was in the middle of a game. I was in the middle of doing this. I was in the middle of that. I don't care. She's more important. And quite frankly, your life is no longer about you.
Amen.
It's about her. Husbands, understand. Wives, understand. One day we will stand before God and we will have to give an accounting for the other. And men, God's going to stand there and he's going to look at us and he said, did you give yourself up for your wife? Did you give yourself up for your wife? This was the standard. You saw Jesus on the cross. That's the example. Is that what you did? And he's going to look at our wives. And he's going to say, you wife, did you give yourself over freely, willingly, completely to your husband? Let's get in the game, church, because this is what it's really about. You want the peace of Christ? You want the message of Christ to dwell among you richly, then this is how we get there. And it has to start here in the church, because the world's not going to do it. Not only is the world not going to do it, but they're going to look at us and call us insane for trying to do it. But you want to know where true contentment comes from? Do you want to know where true happiness comes from? Not from seeking your own pleasure, but from seeking someone else's. And this is practice, church, that we got to get good at, because guess what? When we go home, that's where the practice is. We practice within our homes, within our families, for living the way we ought to, because then when we come together as the church, you have a lot of husbands, you have a lot of men in the church who are used to what? Giving themselves up for someone else. And you have a lot of wives who are what? Who are used to placing themselves under their husbands. So then when we come together as the church family, we've already had practice at the roles that we're called to do here in the church. We have practice at getting along, men and women. You want to know why churches don't get along? Do you want to know why churches fracture? Because the families are fractured. Because the families don't get along. Because the families, when they go home, they're at each other's throats. Why? Because wives are trying to wear the pants. It's just that simple. Wives have decided they have to be the head. Our culture tells them that's what you ought to do, and so that's what they do. And men, they check out. And if you go back to the garden, that's exactly what happened in the garden, isn't it? The tempter came along and looked at Eve and said, look, isn't this good for you? And she went, oh yeah, that looks real good for me. Yeah, I like that a lot. Ooh, shiny. And the husband sat there and did nothing. So you tell me who has the greater sin. Husbands, love your wives. Give yourself up for her and do not be harsh. Verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Newsflash, children don't know anything. I don't know if you knew this. If you're a parent, you probably know this. But for some reason, some odd reason, our culture today has decided that children ought to determine everything about themselves. And they ought to do it when they're like really young, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's insane. Children, your responsibility is to do what you're told. Sit down, shut up, and do what you're told. It's really that simple. I'm sorry. Like, I don't know what else to say. Look, I was in the military, y'all. I don't have time. I don't have time for games. There's a mission to be done. Children, your parents tell you what to do, do it. It's that simple. You want to know why? There will be a time, right? The very next verse on this, children obey your father. Do not embitter your children, right? So there will be a time where your father or your mother has to sit there and explain to you as a child why you're doing things. And that's really important. That needs to come. That's part of childhood development. But in the meantime, practice shutting up and doing what you're told. And it's a skill that's been forgotten. You know how I know? I took my 5 kids to HEB. I took my 5 kids to HEB. My wife was out of town. And I know I can order curbside, but apparently I'm a sadist. And I took all 5 of those kids, and I grabbed the shopping cart. We had been gone for 2 weeks, so there was no food in the house. It had to be done, and I walked through HEB. Do you know what I learned? I learned that because in my house, I frequently tell my children to sit down and shut up and do what they're told, that I can navigate HEB with 5 kids better than families with 1. That's what I found out. I found out the world has no idea how to raise children. Have no clue. I also found out I never want to do that again. Because even the best behaved children, when there's 5 of them, it's a nightmare. Gabriel wanted to touch everything. Oh my gosh. Children, obey your parents in everything. Parents, tell your children what to do. Stop asking them what they want. They don't know. They don't know. They think they know. Gabriel, the CPS worker came in to check on Gabriel in Judah, and they come in every month. And he looked at her and he said, I don't want to be here anymore. He said, I don't want to be here anymore. And my heart about fell out of my chest, you know, because I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, I don't want to be here anymore because they put me in timeout. Yeah. Never had that before in his entire life. He'd never been put in timeout. 7 years old. I looked at that boy and I said, son, after she had left, I looked at that boy and I said, son, I'm sorry, because your life is going to be exponentially more difficult than everyone else. You are learning at 7 what all of these other kids learned at 3 and 4, and that's to do what you're told. It doesn't mean children are going to be perfect at it. It doesn't mean they're going to even be great at it. But the other kids are much better at it than he is. Now, he's learning, but his life is going to be harder because he's got to learn at 7 what others learned at 3 and 4. So children, obey your parents, and fathers, do not embitter your children. They will become discouraged. Now, this is verse 22. And this verse has been taken out of context. This whole passage, in fact, has been completely taken out of context and ruined over and over and over again. Verse 22 says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. And again, our culture in the 21st century collectively gasps. You see, the Bible's evil and wicked. It encourages slavery. No, it doesn't. That's not what's being told here. You know how I know? In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10, Paul makes the point that if you're a slave trader, you're standing against God. You are not doing what God expects you are. In fact, you will be condemned, just like all the other evildoers, because you're a slave trader. He looks at slaves in Corinth and he says, he's telling all the other Christian Corinthians, he's telling them, hey, you need to stay where you are at. Wherever God called you, that's where you need to stay. If you were married when God called you, you need to stay married. If you were single when God called you and you cannot burn with passion, you need to remain single. If you're a slave, you need to remain where you're at, unless you have the opportunity to become free. And then that's much better. The scriptures do not support slavery. How could they? Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is the most anti-slavery verse you could possibly find. God made them in his image. All mankind, not just one man, not just one person, not just one woman, all mankind, male and female, he created them in the image of God. And somehow it's okay to enslave fellow image bearers? What? Well, Cole, if that's the case, then why didn't the church put a stop to slavery? They did. In the 1800s. What do you think pushed the end of slavery? Christians in the Western world said, this is horrible, this is horrific, we can't keep doing this, this is inconsistent with the Word of God, we should not do this. And our country fought a war to bring it to an end. But Paul looks at these people in Colossians, and because we're called to peace, because we're called, what does he say? He says, slaves in verse 22, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Hear this, it is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. There's a couple things we need to understand about this passage, church. It's the vast majority of Christians in the first century were slaves. That's number one. The reason Paul is saying this, the reason Paul is going over this is not because there is a small minority population of slaves in the church. The vast majority of Christians in the first century were slaves. That's number one. Number two is this. He turns around and he looks at masters in chapter 4, verse 1. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. What does this mean? This means that God is going to judge us in the way we deal with our familial relationships. He's going to stand in judgment over him, and there are severe expectations. But those expectations, you can turn it to the invitation slide. Those expectations, church, are based on who Christ is and what he has done for us. So this morning, church, if you've forgotten that the point of Christianity is to give yourself up for someone else, if you've forgotten that the way we run this race is not through some law code or some checking off of boxes, but is rather more about loving others, choosing to surrender yourself to others. Or if you're out there this morning and you've never obeyed the gospel, you've never been baptized into Christ, if you need to come, I'm going to be right there back in the room. We have elders standing up in the back. If you need to come, I encourage you to come as we stand and as we sing.